Good evening. I'm Joanne Myers, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us as we welcome Yale Law School professor Amy Chua to this public affairs program. Professor Chua may be known to many of you as the author of the best-selling book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, Yet she honed her reputation as a noted expert in the fields of ethnic conflict and globalization. Her previous books, World on Fire and Day of Empire, address these issues, as does her recent book, Political Tribes, Group Instinct, and the Fate of Nations. Political Tribes is the focus of her discussion today, and it will be available for you to purchase during the reception at the end of the hour. A specter is haunting the world. No longer nameless, tribal politics is now pervasive. Yet here in the United States, as a country that was founded in the ideal of having a shared national identity, we thought we had escaped its worst impulses. However, following the shock results of the US elections in 2016 and a few foreign policy mishaps, such as in Iraq and Afghanistan, it has become increasingly apparent that we failed to take into account the power and the importance of tribal politics. If there is a common theme to this malaise currently paralyzing our politics and influencing our foreign policy decisions, it is the idea that group identities matter, and any attempt to promote the common good on any front is quickly and effectively dismissed. Belonging to a group can be healthy, but when identity turns competing groups into enemies whose main purpose is not just to advance their own side, but to provoke, condemn, and defeat the other, it becomes a mechanism that steals our identity as a nation and threatens our democracy. In Political Tribes, our guest takes her argument in two directions, one foreign, one domestic, to show that to ignore the role of tribalism in politics and society, whether within or outside the US, is to do so at our own peril. Professor Chua urges us to begin a long overdue discussion on how to repair the deep divisions we've been witnessing in this fractious political climate. The purpose to transcend identity politics and rediscover our national identity before it's too late. To commence this timely and important conversation, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guest this evening, Amy Chua. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, and thank you all for coming this evening. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to be speaking here at the Carnegie Council, an institution whose mission and work I've admired for so long. So many thanks for inviting me and organizing everything so perfectly. So human beings, like our fellow primates, are tribal. We are hardwired to be that way. We literally need to belong to groups. We crave group membership. And once we connect to a group, we want to cling to it and defend it and see our group as better in every way. So in one fascinating recent study that I described, and there are tons of these, researchers took children between the ages of 4 and 8 and split them randomly into two groups, red and blue, and assigned corresponding t-shirts. They then sat these kids at computer docks, and showed them pictures, computer-edited pictures of lots of random children. Half of them wearing red t-shirts, half of them wearing blue t-shirts. They asked for the kids' reactions to these pictures. The results were astonishing. Even though these children knew nothing about the children in the images, absolutely nothing, they all said that they consistently liked the people wearing their color better, wanted to allocate more resources to people wearing those colors, and basically thought they were superior in every way. Almost more disturbingly, they displayed strong unconscious bias. So they were told stories about these groups of these kids. And amazingly, the children systematically tended to remember all the positive things about the children wearing their t-shirt and all the negative things about the people in the other t-shirt. And these are kids between 4 and 8. So the group instinct is very hardwired in us, and it's not only, unfortunately, an instinct to belong, it is also an instinct to exclude, if we don't try. Once we connect to a group, our identities become oddly bound up with it. Sports is obviously the best example. I mean, facts start not to matter. And studies show that its group membership is almost like a drug, believe it or not, the effect it has. We will seek to benefit our group members even when we personally gain nothing. We will take pleasure. It shows up in neurological tests when out-group members fail and sometimes when they suffer. We will sacrifice and even kill and die for our groups. Now, in many parts of the world, including the regions of greatest national security interest to the United States, the group identities that matter most to the people on the ground are unfortunately ones that Americans are barely aware of, often just completely ignorant about. Often these identities are not national, which we're comfortable thinking about, but ethnic, religious, sectarian, regional, or clan-based. In our foreign policy, as I show with several cases, for at least a half century, we have been spectacularly blind to the importance of group identity. We tend to view the world in terms of these great ideological battles: communism versus capitalism, democracy versus authoritarianism, and most recently, the free world against the axis of evil. Blinded by these ideological prisms, we have repeatedly ignored the more primal group identities, which for billions are the ones that are most powerful and important to them, and which drive political upheaval all over the world. This blindness has led to some of our greatest foreign policy disasters in the last 50 years. I would probably say all of them. So, take Vietnam. We saw everything through a Cold War lens. We saw ourselves as fighting a great enemy, communism, and the idea was that if little Vietnam fell, the whole region, Southeast Asia, would go communist. That was the domino theory. But because of these blinders, we missed the extent to which the Vietnamese people were actually fighting for their independence, which, after having been colonized for over 1,000 years, first and importantly by the Chinese, really the big enemy, and then by the French. So in 1995, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War, met his former counterpart, the foreign minister of Vietnam. It was these two former enemies coming together. And the former enemy said to Secretary McNamara, "You must never have read a history book. If you had, you would know that we weren't pawns of China. Don't you understand that we've been fighting China for 1,000 years? We were fighting for our independence, and we would fight for our last man, to the last man. And no amount of bombing, no amount of US pressure could have stopped us." So far from being communist China's pawn, by 1979, Vietnam was at war with China. China was actually the biggest enemy. It's not even the United States for them. When you ask them who is the great rival, it's literally the behemoth to the north that sits like a giant genie on a tiny lamp. But because we thought it was all about communism, we missed that. But we missed something almost more important, and this is something I bet many of you don't know. I mean, because if you've watched the recent films, you probably understand this part about nationalism. There was an additional ethnic dimension internal to the country, which doomed us from the beginning in the battle for the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. And that is that, like all the countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, the Philippines, where my own family's from, Vietnam had inside a market-dominant minority. And this is a term that I coined in 2003, and it refers to an ethnic minority that controls a vastly disproportionate amount of a nation's wealth. For example, the 3% Chinese in Indonesia today control about 70% of the private economy. It's very uncomfortable for Americans to deal with this type of group. We're much more comfortable with groups that are both economically and politically oppressed. We understand how to react ethically to that. But a group that is very economically strong but politically vulnerable, much, much more complicated. So in Vietnam, on the eve of our invasion, a deeply resented 1% Chinese minority known as the Hua, historically it controlled as much as 70 to 80% of the economy. They had been favored by the French, who did their divide and conquer thing. In other words, just think about it. We're coming in saying we're going to bring in capitalism. And yet what we missed was that a hugely disproportionate number of the capitalists in Vietnam were not even the Vietnamese people. They were part of this hated outsider minority, despised by the Vietnamese, both northern and southern alike. And the Chinese minority, tiny numbers, 1%, weren't just rich, they were viewed as the smug, exploitative, insular outsider group. They lived amongst themselves in a little place outside Saigon. They intermarried only with themselves, spoke their own language, went to their own schools, and openly seemed to not care about the Vietnamese people. Most of them dodged the draft and didn't even fight in the war. Because we missed this ethnic side of the angle, and part of it is racism. There are quotes where the same foreign minister said, "We were all just gooks to you." People just couldn't tell the difference. But because we missed this angle, virtually every pro-capitalist step we took in Vietnam just further inflamed popular resentment against us. America's wartime policies directly benefited this little entrepreneurial group who were the middlemen in the country. U.S. needed supplies, provisioning, networks. It was all the Chinese. Not to mention the brothels and the black market, which the Chinese also ran. Moreover, the regime that we installed was seen as incredibly corrupt and illegitimate, and again, in cahoots with these corrupt Chinese businessmen. So if we had actively wanted to turn the Vietnamese people around us, we could hardly have come up with a better formula. I don't know if I'm old enough to remember in the late 70s, there were boat people. We heard of them as Vietnamese boat people. Many of them arrived in California, where I was. Unbelievably, for example, in 1978, 80% of the Vietnamese boat people were actually ethnic Chinese. And I've actually talked to students about this. They'll say they're Vietnamese, and I'll ask them. And they'll say, no, I'm Vietnamese. And I'll say, go ask your parents or your grandparents. And they'll come back, I can't believe it. And the reason they didn't admit it is because there were these ethnic cleansing programs. So people didn't want to admit it. They just said they were Vietnamese. Our blindness to group identity also fatally undermined our military intervention in Afghanistan. After 9/11, we intervened. This time, we didn't have a Cold War lens. Now we had a big anti-Islamist lens. And we saw the Taliban as just a bunch of cave-dwelling fundamentalists harboring Osama bin Laden. And once again, we missed the ethnic and tribal identities that are all important in Afghanistan. Afghanistan's national anthem mentions 14 different ethnic groups. And the largest three are the Pashtuns, the Uzbeks, and the Tajiks. And the crucial point here, which I'll try to condense this, but I explain it in the book, is that the Taliban is not just a religious fundamentalist movement. It is also an ethnic movement. Afghanistan was founded and ruled for basically hundreds of years by this biggest group, the Pashtuns. A lot of people think of the Pashtuns as the same thing as Afghans. They just use these terms interchangeably. But we didn't know anything about this. And when we intervened, the Pashtuns, long so dominant, had started to lose their historical dominance for a variety of reasons in the Cold War, and they were very threatened by the Uzbeks and the Tajiks. Well, we missed this. So when we intervened and we impressively toppled the Taliban, at least temporarily, I mean, they came right back. But when we did so by allying ourselves with something called the Northern Alliance that unfortunately was really viewed as being mainly populated with the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, the main rivals of the Pashtuns. So we were seen as allying ourselves with these threatening rival groups. And then the government that we set up was again seen as favoring these other groups. And marginalizing the Pashtuns. And this turned enormous numbers of ordinary Pashtun Afghanistan citizens against us. As oppressive as the Taliban is, many Pashtuns would prefer to have them in power than having their rival ethnic groups that they view as persecuting them. So 17 years after we intervened, the Taliban is still around, our troops are still mired there, and almost none of our key objectives have been met. In Iraq, very quickly, we obviously missed the depth of the division between the Sunnis and Shia and the Kurds. We missed the central importance of the tribal loyalties in that country. I just did an amazing event with General David Petraeus last night, and he said this was really the biggest lesson. It wasn't about increasing troops, it was realizing how important these tribal networks were. People would do what their tribal leaders said. Most important, we missed something more specific. And coming back to the original term, we missed the fact that Iraq had its own version of a market-dominant minority. On the eve of the US's invention, Iraq's roughly 15% Sunni minority dominated the country economically, politically, and militarily. They had been dominant actually for a long time under the Ottomans and then under the British, who again loved to do the sort of divide and rule, favoring and ruling through a minority, and finally under Saddam Hussein, who was a Sunni and who favored not just the Sunni but his own tribes people. And the Shia, the 60% Shia majority, represented most of the country's poor, many of them living in slums outside cities like Baghdad. And I actually predicted what would happen in Iraq in the afterword to World on Fire, my book, in 2003. And not just kind of like, oh, I don't think it will go well, but very specifically, what I said is if you look at these demographics, it's a pattern I've seen over and over. When you have this really resented minority who's been in control for a long time, and you suddenly bring in democracy. You know, America tends to romanticize democracy. Democracy is going to melt away these group identities and bring everybody together. I said that in these conditions, when you suddenly empower this resentful majority, it can actually catalyze group conflict. And that's exactly what happened. You saw these rise of demagogues who, on both sides, and the Sunnis realizing, so the Shias voted for the Shias, the Sunnis with the Sunnis, Kurds for the Kurds. And when the Sunnis realized that as only 15%, democracy was not going to be good for them, they just resisted. They started the insurgency. They didn't want democracy. And it's from there that ISIS arose. ISIS is really a Sunni movement directed not just at wiping out the West, but also infidel Shias. Now, so once again, because of our failure to see the central importance of these group and sectarian and tribal identities, we, despite having unrivaled military power and despite spending over $1 trillion, suffering thousands and thousands of casualties, we failed. We did not end up producing a model of free market democracy for the Middle East. Instead, democracy led to civil war and eventually to ISIS. Okay, now when it comes to what to do, there is a serious ethical issue here. We have to be careful. So I used to have a whole chapter on this because I'm fascinated, but the British, in their colonial heyday, were actually just the opposite of us. They were so group conscious. I found these old colonial handbooks from India, and they knew everything about India's castes and what religions and what they wore and what they ate, and it was so well documented. They were intensely aware of those group differences. But, and here's the cautionary note, what did they do with that knowledge? They used that knowledge to divide and to subordinate and to deliberately pit groups against each other for their own benefit. And many people believe that Britain's group-conscious policies actually hardened and in some cases actually created many of these group identities that are still leading to time bombs today. So there are clear dangers here. Nevertheless, in a nutshell, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. I think that if we want our foreign policy to be effective, who doesn't want our foreign policy to be effective? If we want to stop pursuing losing strategies and then finding ourselves having to come up with fifth and sixth best solutions after things are already in chaos, we need to be more knowledgeable about the group identities that matter most to the people that we're supposedly trying to help. In the book, I do explain one striking example of the U.S. being so successful when it finally paid attention to these group differences. And it's actually in the 2007 surge. General Petraeus, General McMaster, they realized that, it's been 4 years, it's just more and more beheadings, the whole place is taken over, and they switched. It wasn't just an increase in troops, but it was literally lessons in the difference, what the tribes did, the difference between Shia and Sunni, bringing in people who spoke the language, and they saw dramatic successes. Okay, I'm happy to say more in Q&A, but I want to turn now to the United States. So I want to start with an anecdote. When I started writing this book 3 years ago, it was originally going to be just a foreign policy book. But last February, just a month after Donald Trump was elected, I was teaching a class that I've taught for 20 years, international business transactions, 80 students. And I was doing the same shtick that I've done for 20 years, saying the reason we mess up our foreign policy is because other countries, developing countries, have such different group dynamics that we're so unfamiliar with, so we keep getting it wrong. And then I'm literally reading a passage from my own book talking about how democracy in these countries can give rise to demagogues with no political experience who sweep to power on a wave of racially tinged populism. And I stopped, to the horror of it, I stopped and all 80 eyes are staring at me, thinking the same thing, which one student articulated, which is, sounds like you're describing the United States. And that actually, I scrambled, and the book is really much more interesting to me now because I had to change my own view. A central point of the book is, and it's really stark. It's only when I saw the progression that I realized this. But the U.S. today is starting to display destructive political dynamics, much more typically associated with developing countries, ethno-nationalist movements, the erosion of trust in our institutions and electoral outcomes, and above all, the transformation of democracy into an engine of zero-sum political tribalism. Why? In part, it's because of the massive demographic transformation that we've been seeing, with whites on the verge of losing their majority status for the first time in U.S. history. For basically 200 years, whites were just comfortably dominant in every way, economically, politically, culturally. So it felt like we had no tribalism and that democracy always worked because there was kind of a very dominant tribe. Today, however, something's different. Now every group feels threatened. It's not just minorities, African Americans who feel threatened, whites feel threatened. A study I cite in my book shows that 67% of working class whites believe that there is more discrimination against whites than against minorities. It's not just Jews and Muslims who feel threatened, Christians feel threatened. You can hear this in the rhetoric. With the Me Too movement, women feel threatened with Donald Trump in the White House. With the Me Too movement, men also feel threatened. Straights and gays both feel threatened, Latinos, Asians. And the thing is that when groups feel threatened, that's when they become more insular and defensive, and they close ranks and they become more tribal. And that is why we're starting to see open identity politics on both sides of the political spectrum. So that's a piece of it. But there's something else. There's another reason that we're starting to see these developing country style dynamics. It used to be a big difference between the United States and the developing countries I studied that we didn't have a market-dominant minority. We always had a dominant majority, economically, politically, everything. And politically speaking, this was actually a very stable, if invidious, outcome. The minorities just stayed oppressed. But today, something has changed. And all this rhetoric about, white supremacy, I think just analytically confuses things. What has happened is that class, or really educational difference, has split America's white majority. Roughly speaking, the whites on the coasts or cities, not necessarily wealthy, but just sort of more educated, professional, pretty much everyone in this room, That divide and the working class, rural, southern whites now are so different that they are practically like different ethnic groups. Again, I have an article on ethnicity. There's like a 15-page footnote defining what ethnicity is. And one of the hallmarks is intermarriage. And there is actually so little intermarriage between these two groups of whites now. We're much more likely to see here things like my own family. My kids are half Chinese, half Jewish. It's the most common thing. My neighbors are half Muslim, half Korean. But when do you find, because there's such a cultural difference, when do you see, a blue-collar person from the middle of America with somebody from here? Very, very rare. And what's happened is, because of these changes, we are starting to see the emergence in America of our own version of a market-dominant minority, and it is these coastal elites. Again, this is a misleading term. They're not all coastal, and they're not all elites in the sense of being wealthy. But with some important caveats, it's really striking how much coastal elites resemble market-dominant minorities. It is the fact that wealth in this country is extraordinarily concentrated on the coasts. Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Washington establishment. Although America's coastal elites are obviously not a single ethnic minority, they're not a religious minority, they are extremely insular. They eat similarly, they dress similarly, they have similar values, usually cosmopolitan, and they view themselves as very tolerant. We even have our own language. I mean, I teach on a college campus. I mean, all the terms, we know how to be sensitive, to speak a certain way. And they dominate key sectors of the economy. And this is the kind of dangerous thing, from the point of view of many people in the middle of the country who actually have not usually interacted with minorities or Muslims, or, it's very concentrated in these cities, coastal elites are viewed as minority-loving, immigrant-loving, caring more about the poor in Africa than about real Americans. And so you get this dynamic that is very parallel to, other countries. So what happened in America in 2016, November 2016, is actually exactly what I would have predicted for a developing country pursuing elections in the presence of a resented minority seen as arrogant and all-powerful. The rise of a populist movement in which demagogic voices called on real Americans to take back their country. Make America great again. Actually, President Trump has actually used those terms. We need to take back our country from China and Mexico. So seeing that Trumpism is part of a global pattern, and not just related to Europe's right-wing nationalist parties, but actually a lot like these developing countries, raises a lot of interesting ethical issues. First of all, with respect to our foreign policy, I think it highlights the fact that we just need to stop thinking that democracy is a panacea for everything. Democracy often brings results that we don't like. So we need to think, what exactly should we be promoting? And what is democracy? Maybe my own view is that we export a form of democracy that is not even what we have, just kind of overnight, majority rule. Milosevic was elected. Hitler was elected. Now, it also, and I'll end with this, seeing the coastal elites as possibly our own tribe, or viewed as a market-dominant minority, is also sobering. In my research, I've actually found no country that's ever successfully overcome this problem. That is, all over the world, when this dynamic takes hold of a nation's politics, the result is lurches towards authoritarianism, a lot of hate-mongering, and then, here's the thing, an elite backlash against the popular side of democracy. And I think if you think about it, we can talk about it during Q&A. I think the elite backlash against the popular side. That could be trying to disenfranchise and gerrymander, so a lot of poor African Americans can't vote. You could see some of that. But also, what is new in our discourse is many super liberal elites are now talking about maybe we should have knowledge requirements for voting because they're thinking, maybe, the New Yorker recently quoted a book by Jason Brennan, a libertarian political philosopher at Georgetown, who wrote that excluding the bottom 80% of white workers from voting might be just what poor blacks need. That's tempting. We all know where those feelings are coming from, but that is not the way forward. And this is a strand of thinking that has been very common in Latin American countries. Maybe very worried about democracy. If any way exists, if any answer exists, it will have to be both economic and cultural. Restoring upward mobility should be viewed as an emergency. Part of what's contributing to all this zero-sum feeling is that it used to be the case that somebody from a working class family in the middle of the country could just do public education, rise, go to the coast, come back, there'd be this fluidity. Now it's too expensive to live on the coast. Education has transformed to this weird thing. You have to pay for tutors. It's almost impossible to get into these top universities. Those avenues have been closed off. But it's also going to be cultural. We are starting to see the breakdown of national unity. We're starting to see the fracturing of our country into two or possibly more Americas, in which we view people who voted for the other side not just as people we disagree with, but as immoral, evil, as enemies. And we need to break out of this. And so I will say that my own answer to this is we all need to remember what made us America special in the first place. Alone among the major powers of the world, including England and France, America is what I call a supergroup. There are two requirements to this. First, a supergroup has to have a very strong, overarching national identity, American. But, and this is where I differ from Mark Lila and a lot of the people straight against identity politics, the second requirement of a supergroup is that we are a country that allows individual subgroup identities to flourish. So that you can say, I can be a Croatian American, a Libyan American, a Chinese American, and yet intensely patriotic at the same time. So I'm more optimistic because this is baked into our Constitution. I've studied comparative systems for 20 years. This is other countries, major democracies, really have a much more ethnic component to it. They have an established religion. We've never lived up to our ideals, but our identity as embedded in the Constitution is ethnically and religiously neutral, and it does not belong to any particular subgroup. So I think my time, is that about, I have lots more to say, but I think I'll just open it up to questions and take it from there. Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Well, you certainly have given us a lot to think about, so I'm sure there are many questions, and I would just invite you to go to the microphones on either side and to introduce yourself and try to keep your question brief and to the point. Thank you. Start over here.
Hi, my name is Charles Liebling. Among the developing ethnically split countries, you seem to mention, I think, that there aren't any really good models of countries that have figured it out. But are there any who have done it relatively well? And just is the Singapore model a successful model, or is it a model at all?
Great. So Singapore, as you know, is the classic case of a country with what we might call a beneficent dictator. He was an authoritarian, Lee Kuan Yew, but he really was not corrupt. Everything was top down, and there was a lot of social engineering. He was very proud that he said, we don't, even though they have Malays, Chinese, and Indians, that we have no ethnic conflict, because even within buildings, it would be quotas. This many people live here, this percent Chinese, this percent Indian, and it is, just as an American, it feels very sterile to me, not vibrant. And my only answer about whether authoritarianism or beneficent dictator is something we should think about is I think democracy, like most people, is the best institution. simply because you can never guarantee that the dictator will stay beneficent. There's just no check on that. Democracy, no matter how much we hate the leader, as long as our democratic institutions are robust, and that's something we need to police, will be voted out, can be voted out. Bad policies can be voted out. So for me, to your first question, again, I'm an optimist. I was just saying that in developing countries with this market-dominant minority, there are really not very many successful examples of a well-functioning democracy. What you tend to see instead is actually the powerful minority, like let's say the Chinese in the Philippines or the Chinese in maybe Burma. They are so powerful with their money that they go into cahoots with the indigenous majority leader, and you get a kind of crony capitalist situation that is very stable, actually. And actually, Wall Street tends to love this because it's not a democracy. Markets are free and flourishing. There's a lot of foreign investment. That was under General Suharto, was under Marcos in the Philippines. And I think again, raising ethical questions, I think from my analysis, as you'll see in the book, is I think we've deluded ourselves. We look at a place like that, we see that's a good democracy. But if you actually look at what's going on, it's really, the poor people are not really exercising the power of their numbers. So, I think we can do it better. I think our role, we can do it better if we are more cognizant of these identities on the ground. But it takes a lot more thought. Our intervention in Libya, President Obama was so honest. He said, our analysts, we toppled Gaddafi very quickly, incredibly successful, and then we left. And after, it's now pretty much a failed state. President Obama said now it will be for the people of Libya to come together. Well, the people of Libya are 140 different tribes, and it just disintegrated into civil war, and now is practically a failed state. And President Obama said the degree of tribal division in Libya was much deeper than our analysts expected, very honest. And he also said that not preparing for the day after in Libya was the worst mistake of his presidency. So I think there's learning. I think people are recognizing this and trying to do better. Yeah. Oh.
Thank you for that presentation. My name is Tarek, and my question is about what you've explained as an us versus them mentality. Very intrinsic in the tribal intergroup dynamic. Now that we can agree that we have this going on currently in the U.S., two questions. The first one is, if we establish then there is a resentment between the central part of America versus the coastal, economically, politically, and perhaps culturally at this point, then how do you explain that they picked someone from New York who was born on a bed of cash and went to an Ivy League school? The second question is, given the centrifugal and centripetal of the dynamics pushing us to the opposite side of the spectrum, is there a threshold where we cross over to the outlier side that there is no return?
Yeah. Okay, so I actually think the answer to your first question is our own blindness to the group identities that matter most to people on the ground. And I discussed this idea of billionaire populism. It's not a mystery to me at all. I understand the idea. What is wrong with these working class whites in the middle of the country? Are they stupid? Can they not see that he's a billionaire? Or is it, the other alternative is it that they're just so racist that it doesn't matter, that they would take that hit? Those statements may describe some people who voted for Trump, but I think they also reflect some of the condescension that got Donald Trump elected in the first place. And I think that Donald Trump has very successfully and not entirely falsely presented himself as the same member of their cultural tribe. It really is true that in the way he speaks, the way he dresses, the way he wants to watch worldwide wrestling, which repels most of us, and the flag-waving NASCAR, oh my God, we're cosmopolitans, that's so intolerant. even the way he gorges himself on McDonald's, where we're all, eating vegan and doing, recycling, and and every time something comes out of his mouth that is racist and sexist and misogynist, scandal after scandal, all of us were like, this is it. Now he's out, right? Nothing happens. Why? Because even that is actually relatable. For a lot of these people, constantly being called out in their workplace, oh, you're racist, oh, and again, this tribal instinct. Once you connect with a tribe, you just want to defend your tribal member, and he's like their tribal champion. So it's almost like, he may be awful, but he's our awful. We know he's a blowhard. You should see that. So that's why I think you see a lot of the approval ratings staying pretty, at least among his base. Different question what will happen with women. I think that's kind of interesting. And maybe I'll come back to the other one later. I think I'm talking too long. I'll come, if I recall the question. Yeah.
Carol.
Carl Meyer, listen, my wife and I are broadly sympathetic with what you're arguing, and now I want you to apply your own analysis to the case of Iraq and Syria. That where do we come out in Syria and in Iraq? You have the particular dilemma that one of the first things that Bremer did as the surrogate there was to dissolve the army, which was chiefly Sunni.
Yeah.
But if he had not done that, he would have set up a government that had to depend for the military on the very group that was being displaced. So I don't know how you would come out on that.
Yeah. On Iraq, I have a whole chapter on this, and I think it's very clarifying. This, this de-Baathification thing. This is something we do a lot. We did it in Afghanistan too. It's this idea. We have the Nazi model in mind. So it's like, okay, we're coming in. These are the bad guys. So we take them out. The problem is that the Sunnis were also all the doctors, the school teachers. They ran everything. And secondly, as in Afghanistan too, with the Pashtuns, a lot of people, there were some terrible Baathist killers, but others were just kind of joining their tribe. It's the only way to get a job. So I think that there was, I don't think that's a tough one. I don't know what the perfect solution is, but I think we did the worst thing. In fact, there are some studies I cite that the leading commanders of ISIS were actually many of the top military officers in the Iraq army, and they literally were fired and just had no way to feed their families. And the only thing they knew how to do is fight, and they had access to weapons. So I almost feel like we couldn't have done it incorrectly. It was a great honor for me, actually, to speak to General Petraeus, because I have no special connection to him. I was terrified. I actually, I'm very critical of these efforts. And he really has very much the same view that going forward, we need to be the idea of living with people, the communities. Instead of what we did is we were holed up. The U.S. military in these zones, no interaction. If you actually start to interact with these people as human beings, you can get a lot more done. Oh, Syria, I don't want to say too much about because I'm actually not a big expert on the latest thing. Syria does have I think, an equivalent of a market-dominant minority, but it's complicated. Honestly, I don't want to pronounce about Syria right now because I don't know exactly. To me, we are at the point of a 10th best solution, which is where, so my book is more, can we, for once, try to get it right the first time? Right? At this point with Syria, so many things happening. I just don't feel qualified to say what is the next right step. But I do feel pretty confident when you start looking. For me, it's very much like just the numbers. Just pay simple attention. Libya, 140 tribes, and also regional divide, west, east, and south under the Italians. And if you just do a little bit of history, you can see where the schisms are. It's not rocket science. It's just kind of almost like 9th grade history. And I think we can do better with even just a minimal more amount of detail. Let me just say one thing positive. I have a whole section on why we're so blind. I think part of it is rooted in what's best about America and part in what's worst about America. But part of the reason that we don't pay attention to the Sunnis and the Syria, is because we have had an extraordinary success story of assimilation in this country. So the idea is, look, if Poles and Hungarians and Germans and Italians could all become Americans within one generation, why can't Sunnis and Shias and Kurds? We just need to have some elections and people will form cross-cutting, and it just doesn't happen that way. And I think part of it is because I actually did a lot of investigation on why our approach is so different from the British. And the other piece I do think is racism, a term I hate because I think it's overused. But I think it's, in Iraq, one of the things that General Petraeus and General McMaster, who's now in the administration, said stop using, there were certain derogatory terms that the soldiers would use to apply to all Arabs. And what General McMaster said is every time you use one of these terms to apply, you are basically just giving points over to the enemy. And so this item, yeah.
Hi, Ron Berenbaum. I just want to make a minor point on your comment on diet, and then I'll ask you my question, which is that don't focus too much on diet. It's important to remember that Hitler was a vegetarian. So I agree with virtually everything you have said, and I found it just a terrific presentation. But one thing I would like to mention is the United States, about the United States, is that we have been here before. Perhaps not to this extreme, but we have a history of what I guess you might call, for lack of a better term, sectarianism. We had the slave states, we had the free states, we had the populists, farm versus city, and then during the Roosevelt administration, we had Father Coughlin's broadcasts, and we had Lindbergh. So we have been here before, but what is common with these previous incidents or episodes, and what is particular to Trump is what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics. All these people think of themselves as victims. They don't think of themselves as getting out there and fighting for themselves. And one thing that I found fascinating, actually, about the recent shooting episode was that when these kids got up there and were on television, they were real victims. I mean, they had been killed, they had been injured, some of them had been killed, and so on, as opposed to people who were victims because they had to take SAT tests and so on. So it's this paranoid style in the United States which is unique. It's the style rather than the substance of the individual groups and the identity and description.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, I've actually, I agree. There are lots of things that we've seen before. We've had nativist movements with every new wave of immigrants, and with every wave we've overcome it. And the rhetoric is very similar. These people can't assimilate, finally. So, I'm an optimist there. We have not had actually that many populist presidents who made it all the way. We have other differences are that we have not had the situation where whites are on the verge of losing their majority status, which I think contributes a little bit or interacts in some ways to the paranoid thing that I would just view as feeling threatened. Actually, the one time that we had something like this, when whites were about to lose their majority status, we did not rise to the occasion. It was in the southern states, about 7 of them after the Emancipation Proclamation, when African Americans were suddenly enfranchised and whites suddenly found themselves a market-dominant minority, terrified at the prospect of democracy, and what they did was Jim Crow. That is, they just blocked it. So we have to do better. I mean, what I try to do in the book is I think that even in what we're saying, at dinner parties, that I'm from the most liberal campus there is, we're tribal too. I think it's important to realize that it's very easy. It's actually pleasurable to demonize the other side. And sure, there's right and wrong, right? If there's a Nazi or something terrible, you have to stand up. But I think when you start to think that 70 million people are Nazis, then you just want to ask yourself, like, am I being tribal? Because tribal mean, are we stereotyping? Are we somehow and it's so funny, the response to my book called Political Tribes has been political tribalism. I keep getting email saying, no, wanting me to really point the finger more at the other side, and I really have not pulled any punches from either side. I'm critical. I think the progressives did not imagine that this identity mongering and victim, worshiping and maybe crying wolf on too many things that are not that important would not only swamp the college campuses, but also help get Donald Trump elected. And on the right, I think a lot of conservative people just kind of went along with all this conspiracy theory, peddling and rage mongering and thinking, oh, this is probably going to just stay in the Rush Limbaugh zone, not realizing that it would fuel this powerful movement. And so I think we all need to elevate ourselves and try to see the other side more as fellow Americans, as opposed to just this enemy that we need to get rid of.
Let me just say one last word before I sit down. Switzerland.
Yeah,
Switzerland.
right, but not a developing country. I mean, Switzerland is.
Because we have several questions remaining, I just want to remind you to keep your question brief and to the point, please. Susan.
Susan Gittelson, thank you for your brilliant analysis and presentation. One further factor that's very upsetting is the lack of personnel in the State Department. And many of us here are graduates of the Columbia School of International Public Affairs and other very sophisticated schools where every effort is made to analyze what's going on among these political tribes. But there is a positive side that you haven't had a chance to discuss, and that is our immigrant tradition. Last week, I went to a session at Baruch on entrepreneurship, and I looked around, and it appeared that 90% were not white and may or may not have been born in the United States. So this was the American dream, that the immigrants come in and may not have anything. And yet, because they have such a drive, they can succeed. And there are schools, educational programs, some don't cost anything, that encourage, that's it. Tell us more about the positive side of the American dream.
I am such a fan of immigration. I'm the daughter of 2 immigrants. I've written 2 books about how immigration is the source of the lifeblood of this country. But instead of saying that, since you put it so eloquently, maybe I'll say something more provocative. As somebody who just is a huge fan of immigration, I think that here's something that maybe progressives should improve on. It's very dislocating to have such demographic change. To have a country that you're used to one way, and I don't think you necessarily have to be a racist to feel anxious about what kind of rules should we have, how do we police our borders, who gets to come in. And it's almost like we're in a game of gotcha, which is, I think people should be allowed to express their anxiety about immigration or terrorism. On a college campus, I would never refer to terrorism from the Middle East. I mean, that would be instant Islamophobia, But people feel this way. So if you don't allow people to express it, and then maybe they're wrong, we can debate it and show them the numbers, the points that you made. If we say you can't say that, because if you raise a question about immigration, you're a xenophobe, you're a racist, it's just going to go underground. And I've seen it with my own eyes, and underground is where it's really ugly. I mean, where you really do have the worst of America. So I think, as to what to do going forward, I think maybe we should start to be a little, just again, not this gotcha on both sides. It's almost like these competing tribes just waiting to land one on the other side. But thank you for your.
I think we'll take these 3 questions, and then that will be it. Okay.
Hi, Kate Fletcher. I was just curious about your interpretation of the interaction between sort of globalization and the rise of ethno-nationalism in the West, because it seems like we're seeing a increased amount of ethno-nationalism in democracies, in Western democracies. And I wonder to what extent that might be a reaction to globalization.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let me just take them all three at once.
Okay, great.
Sandra Stein, in this country, ask your opinion, but it seems to me that besides everything you're saying, there's powerful forces of very powerful financial interests. And a lot of this, I think, is manipulated, and the divisions are being manipulated, from voter suppression to gerrymandering. But from what I don't remember the group, but it's been organized quite a long time. So it's not willy-nilly, and you can see on what they're actually doing in Congress is increasing the income disparity. So I think it's good to look at that as well, fueling this. It works to their interest to fuel these divisions.
And the last question.
Mine is related to some of the observations, which has to do with the robustness or not of our institutions. We have billionaires running, I have nothing against billionaires, but they're running many of these institutions for which they're absolutely not qualified. And the State Department lacking personnel, our judges, our legal system, just to what extent do you have optimism when you really look at our institutions and how they are or are not functioning, including Congress?
Great. Okay, so quickly, so for the first comment, absolutely. I think globalization, and I'm thinking more specifically about the inflow of immigrants. I think what you're seeing in a lot of the European countries is parallel to what we're seeing, like a fear of their country being taken over. And that's usually when ethno-nationalism arises. That ethno-nationalism literally is like, this is our country kind of movements. Maybe I'll address that deeper. I know that I have a short time here afterwards. The second question, yes. So again, I write about billionaire populism. Yes, it's this ironic situation where we have all these working class people putting into office. This is the richest cabinet in modern history. And the policies that they're passing are openly favoring the wealthiest bit, the tax cuts, the opening up of. So yes, there's a lot to be concerned about. And I guess I just view myself, you should see me at dinner parties. We can go, but I'm trying to diagnose how we got here, because I do think there's a lot of confusion. This is going to be the response to the last question, too, that is, maybe this is, again, provocative. I think we like to romanticize democracy. So when we are very uncomfortable when democracy produces a result we don't like. So that's why you see a lot of language about we're in the grip of authoritarianism. And look, I'm very proud of my Yale law students. We're bringing lawsuits. Of course, we have to stand up for the rule of law, constantly looking out for institutions. But what I want to say is that even though Hillary won the popular vote, even if the Russians, did this, Donald Trump is a product of democracy. He is. And it becomes much clearer when you see these other examples that I lay out. And I think our tendency, we're so disgusted that even in the New York Times, they use very careful language because he has strongman leanings. He likes strongmen like Xi and Putin. But so we get mixed up, like we're in the grip. I think we need to kind of address things analytically. If you look at what Donald Trump has actually been able to push through, so far our institutions have been pretty sturdy. We have done a lot of lawsuits, and there's been a lot of things he has not been able to. Many of his most drastic things have not happened. And in fact, we don't even know if he means it when he says he wants to do it. But I know what you mean, but some of this is then political. He's appointed many, many, many conservative judges, and that is going to be worrisome for progressives. But let's be clear: when it's the Democrats' turn, that's what they do, And so, so some of those characters are terrible, and you see the press, which, by the way, is very robust, right? He constantly wants to attack the press, and we have to stand up for that. But just look at cable news. I don't think anybody's being shut down. In fact, I think they're contributing to this tribalism. I don't see a lot of squashing of Fox and MSNBC, So I just think, again, I think in a way that's what the book is trying to do, is by broadening the lens and situating us and comparing us to countries like Venezuela and Afghanistan, saying, look, let's diagnose the pathologies correctly so that we can respond. And by the way, I think in 2018 and 2020, we're going to do better. I think there were some mistakes made even in the messaging on the rich person point. The middle progressives on campuses, and I support this, it's part of their mission is to point out, well, to expose the American dream as a sham, actually. That is to say, you know what? We keep saying we have this American dream, but actually for most of our history, these people couldn't access it. Even today, people don't really, have it. And so, but if you look, the people who are most in favor of socialism, Bernie, redistribution, structural reform, they tend to be well-educated people. And I think that a lot, well, I don't think, I mean, it's in the work shows that being anti-establishment in America is not the same thing as being anti-rich. And just look at popular culture, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, the Apprentice, American Idol, Shark Tank. I mean, this may sound trivial, but people still want hope. This is a country, more than any other country, we have this strange belief, not defying facts, that people can rise. And that's what I cite these Pew studies. Contrary to the reality, I mean, we have worse upward mobility than many European countries, but our belief in it collectively is dramatically higher than any other country. So I think there should be some messaging changes too from progressives. I say at one point that in a way Donald Trump is doing a better job channeling the hope of this American dream with his billionaire, celebrity, thing than people who just get up and talk about structural racism, massive reform. We need to. It's not as hopeful. It's almost like people want to win the lottery. That's. And I think that was it.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. And it's not a long.
Given your track record, your model.
Thank you.
Okay.
There's a table set up. I'll have to. Hello.